Hey Reluctant Preppers, the following interview is an encore presentation of one of our classic interviews for the benefit of our recent subscribers. Hope you enjoy it. Hey Reluctant Preppers, if you haven't heard, we've already started our monthly 1-ounce U.S. Silver Eagle thank you gift to one active Patreon subscriber each month, signed by your host, Dunnigan Kaiser, and you don't want to miss out on that.
Please help us grow by subscribing today at patreon.com/reluctantpreppers.
It was an imposed famine designed to certainly to smash the middle class, to destroy it to the maximum extent possible, and to starve as many people to death as possible while doing it. But they didn't want to expose the Fed to it being vulnerable to criticism that the Fed ought to be destroyed because it did the Great Depression.
Dear friend,
as a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We have a distinguished guest today. Wayne Jett is the author of The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now, published in 2011. He is the managing principal of Classical Capital, has been engaged in economic analysis and publishing and speaking to chartered financial analyst societies on economic and monetary policies since 2005. He had a nearly 3 decades private law practice in California, arguing cases up to and including the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. Court of Appeals. He's here with us to talk about the role, often the unseen role, that bankers and in collusion with governments have played in the formation of our modern era, and the limitations that many of us have encountered and our parents and grandparents have encountered in their lives. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us here in Reluctant Preppers.
Dunnigan, thank you very much for having me, and look forward to our discussion.
I'm extremely interested in your recent book, The Fruits of Graft, Great Depressions Then and Now, for one thing, because as some of my much of my viewing audience is aware, I was the child of parents who grew up in the Great Depression, and my mom in particular spoke with, for me, uncharacteristic for her, surprising bitterness about her resentment towards the role that she believed bankers played, and that her stepfather, who raised her, believed that bankers had played in the demise of the middle class and those struggling to earn a worker's living and so on, and farmers trying to keep their farms together, and small businessmen trying to keep their businesses together through the Great Depression. Her stepdad, who she worked for, ran a Venetian blind and window blind repair shop in Oklahoma City, where she worked all the way through school, and he struggled to keep that business afloat, and was also very sympathetic to the plight of American farmers who were having to slaughter their livestock and burn their crops and so on, because they couldn't get prices that were even worth bringing the stuff to market. And they saw repossession of people's farms. They saw people being foreclosed on. They saw businesses being shuttered and people losing their jobs. But the provocative undercurrent in your book is that a lot of these impacts on Main Street America were in fact the artwork of elite, powerful, international bankers. And if we could start from there and just have you give us an understanding of how you got into this in the first place, because it's a topic of great interest to our viewing audience, because we're living in a time when people are extremely concerned about leveraged risk and huge debts and overinflated stock markets and bond markets, and what would happen if this huge house of cards comes tumbling down. So could you talk to us a little bit about how you got involved in this, and then help us to see how you started to draw those connections between international bankers and the demise of so many American lives?
Be happy to, Dunnigan. It sounds like I'm talking to the right person, because the things you mentioned from your family certainly ring very true with my own experience. Let me tell you, as you said, I practiced law in Los Angeles, Southern California, primarily before the federal courts, but basically business practice, that sort of thing, for close to 30 years. But along around 2000 or thereabouts, I began deciding that I should get into the financial sector, partly in order to try to preserve what assets I've been able to accumulate. Because the tech crash was underway and that sort of thing. That's another story that's covered fully in my book in terms of how that was orchestrated. But in any event, it's most important to get a context of current events by going back and looking to exactly what happened. When I got into the financial sector, I started studying classical economic theory, and I did a paper that I sent to a man back east who had been very influential in that area, Jude Winniski. He was formerly the associate editor of the Wall Street Journal during the 70s, the opinion section, and basically named SupplySide Economics and became himself educated that way by tutoring a couple of well-known classical economists. In any event, I decided that I would get into that area, and I actually became a representative of his firm in the Western States, a very capable economic forecasting firm. And in that circumstance, it led me finally to decide I wanted to look into what really caused the Great Depression. I had some time on my hands, and I never trusted what I'd been told about it. I had my own experiences growing up in the 40s, and know what happened to my parents during that period of time. And when I knew someplace I wanted to look, I wanted to look in the edited diaries, the personal diaries of the man who served Franklin Roosevelt as his Secretary of the Treasury almost the entirety of the 4 terms in which Roosevelt was elected. I went to those diaries and started picking through it. First thing I found, I knew it was important because of what I knew about classical economic theory and the stability of money and the things of that sort. And so I mentioned that to the man that I was working for, and he told me immediately that you have to write a book, which was to me like a slap in the face. I didn't want to do that. I knew how hard it is to do that and how much time it takes. But a few months thereafter, he died unexpectedly, and I was left with deciding what I was going to do from there. And I decided to research more deeply. And what I found was just so significant I couldn't not write and tell others about it. I feel quite sure that what I found must have been known to a substantial number of people back then, including economists, but nobody has told the truth about it. And to this day, they've not responded to my book. The one prominent, relatively prominent public figure who has actually commented about my book, the only one, although there are others whose reviews I certainly value and I appreciate their opinion from the readers that I've had. Robert David Steele, who's often interviewed these days, the former CIA official and operative, read my book and said his beginning statement was, everybody who knows anything substantive about the Great Depression lies about it. I believe he was saying until this book. And I believe that's the case. Let me give you a thumbnail of of the discussion of the actions taken. It's not just bankers doing this from the darkness. It was our public officials. It was our elected officials doing the bidding of these powerful interests who many people call them bankers. I regard them as the owners of the bank. They are the people who have accumulated so much in wealth, merely running a bank is beneath them. They own the banks and tell them what to do, and they tell governments what to do. They tell politicians what to do. They buy them. They control them. And in that circumstance, we have had a ruling elite controlling the United States of America well before the Great Depression. But let me now get, if I may, to exactly the actions taken and who did them to cause the Great Depression. Let me just say to start with, I came to this conclusion based on my research. I didn't have these conclusions when I started. But in order to try to summarize here and make it as clear as possible, the Great Depression was imposed upon the people of America by operatives in the United States government, including our elected presidents, and imposed on the rest of the world as well. There's evidence not only from our own country, but also from other parts of the world during that period of time that in my estimation, proved that it was an intended effect, that it was an imposed famine designed to certainly to smash the middle class, to destroy it to the maximum extent possible, and to starve as many people to death as possible while doing it. And so let me start with how the Great Depression got started. Bernanke and others blame it on what happened during the 1920s, that there was Fed misconduct, bad monetary policy, that there was inflation during the 70s, too much money, there was not enough money in the Great Depression, and so forth. That was really only a shadow background. The Fed, they did not make the major player. Certainly the Fed was controlled by the same people imposing the Great Depression, but they didn't want to expose the Fed to it being vulnerable to criticism that the Fed ought to be destroyed because it did the Great Depression.
Okay.
The way they did the Great Depression is this. Hoover did three wrong things that he knew were wrong when he let them happen. They were not his ideas, but he let them happen, and they got the Depression started. The first is that he knew, and many people knew, the Americans were convinced that the crash of 1929 was greatly caused by stock manipulation. It was a manipulated crash that I describe in detail as to exactly how it was done. But the point is that there were no federal laws at the time. The crash happened, greatly setting back ordinary investors. But over and above that, even after the crash itself, during the 4 years of Hoover's administration, that fraudulent trading continued raping investors, continued driving capital out of the markets, and causing companies to fail, causing factories to be shut down, and so forth. And Hoover did nothing about it. Number two, he signed SmootHawley. When it passed by only 2 to 3 votes, he could have vetoed it. It never would have passed. SmootHawley shut down. He signed it in June of 1930, and within 18 months, imports and exports of the United States were down about 70%. That caused a tremendous contraction in productive needs of the United States, closing of factories, and so forth and so on. Hoover could have stopped that with a word to his supporters, because his supporters controlled the Congress. But he didn't do it. He allowed himself to be rolled on it, And it was another major move by those in power to put the country into an economic shutdown. The third thing he did, with unemployment in the range of 30% nationally, and at the end of 1931, that's 18 months after SmootHawley was signed. In early 1932, Hoover proposes a tremendous increase in federal income taxes. He quadruples the lowest rate, even adding people who didn't have to pay income taxes before. And he trebled the highest rate up into the arena of something in the 70 to 75% range. This was a tremendous increase in income taxes, and at that time, there was no withholding tax. And so anyone owing income taxes had to go to their banks and take out their savings and pay all of it at the end of the year. They made it retroactive to the beginning of 32, and so March 15th at that time was the due date for taxes. And that's what caused the so-called run on the banks. People were going to the banks to withdraw savings to pay taxes in order to comply with the law. And of course, it resulted in closing many small banks. One of the great objectives of the New York banks was to close as many small competitors as possible, and that's exactly what they did. That was the run on the banks. And so with those three things in place, and Hoover doing nothing about it, in fact, even on the financial fraud, the Senate in 1932, the year of the election, finally starts holding hearings on how much fraud there was and how it took place. And it was so outrageous that people were practically coming to the White House with a noose. And so Hoover had been elected in a landslide because of the tremendous prosperity the country was enjoying in 1928. And he was regarded as the most able president ever elected. And yet in 1932, he had served the country so badly, he was ushered out on a rail, and and FDR was elected in a landslide. And of course, the people elected FDR to do exactly what? To repeal exactly the wrong things that that Hoover failed to resolve for the people. But that was more or less indicated by FDR in the campaign as what he would do. In other words, repeal the tax increase, repeal SmootHawley, get the tariffs back down, and do something about the crime on Wall Street. Instead, he did exactly the opposite on all three things, and he did a lot worse than that. I have to take the time to go through a list of things, but every one of the things that I list of what Roosevelt did, I think you will clearly understand it could not possibly have been regarded truly by Roosevelt or those advising him that these were well-meaning actions they were taking. They were absolutely devastating to people in the country, people who worked for a living, people who produced and so forth, and could only have been pursuant to the actually preconceived design to smash the middle class and destroy it as much as possible. Let me go ahead and do these things, if I may.
Please go ahead.
The three things he was elected to undo that Hoover did on first, the fraudulent trading. He, in 1933, his first year in office, they passed the Securities Act of 1933, and it declared it to be a fraud or a federal crime to engage in financial fraud. The problem is that law did not define what a financial fraud was or provide any penalty, so it was useless. So the next year, they came up with another law, the 1934 Securities and Exchange Act. And what did they do in 34? They set up a politically appointed commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, appointed by the president and by each House of Congress. And that commission was given full authority itself to define what a fraud is, to adopt regulations, and to decide who should be investigated and who should be prosecuted. Now, in that circumstance, they appoint the first commissioners. One of them appointed, who became the chairman, the first chairman of the SEC, was Joseph P. Kennedy. He was undoubtedly probably the most well-known operator on Wall Street during the 20s and during the crash.
All right.
On the last day of the crash, he was described in a later article, a book describing his activities during that time, that on the morning of October 29th, which turned out to be the last day of the big crash, that he was sitting on top of the world because he had been shorting the market each of the days of the crash. Now he acted like he was just an investor, and that they said it was probably an exaggeration that he was shorting the market to the extent of $16 million. I think it was most likely so that substantially more than that, even though $16 million was a mighty fortune in the circumstances of 1929. You remember at that time, the dollar was worth $20.67 per ounce of gold. So many times more valuable than it is now. And so even $16 million would have been a lot to short. But essentially what the fraudulent traders were doing then was what they called at the time watering the stock. That is, they were selling counterfeit stock, shares that they didn't have, selling them short and failing to deliver. And then because they covered before the time the markets could get around to processing the delivery of their stock, they would have covered already because they knew they were going to, the stock price would be pushed up again, and then they would short again at the top. That's what happened each of the days of the crash of 29.
And just for the benefit of all of our listeners, you're talking about Joseph Kennedy, who's the father of JFK?
That's correct. He became an advisor of FDR during the 32 campaign, and as I say, then became for just a year the SEC chairman. And by being the chairman, he was able to make sure that his cronies or his appointees, his hand-selected individuals, became the commissioners and the ones who were going to permanently staff the SEC. And so they were able, from that point on, and it still is true to this day, the SEC does not pursue the big players in the market. They do not go after the big players who fraudulently naked short sell, is what they call it now, so many shares of stock that produced the crash of 2008, what they call the financial terrorism. That was actually facilitated by the SEC itself during 2008. I could go into detail about that, but I don't have the time now. That's, again, covered in my book. But that's what happened with the SEC. The second thing related to the SmootHawley. Instead of repealing SmootHawley, which he easily could have gotten done, it was certainly opposed by all except the big manufacturers and big labor. It could have been done politically, and it was far more important to other countries of the world. Their import-export business was 25% or more of their economies. Ours was under 10%, but yet our that 10% was down 70%, as I said, by the end of 1931. So it would have been very helpful to our country to repeal SmootHawley. He actually appointed a Secretary of State who was dedicated to repealing SmootHawley. But that Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, immediately organized or went to a conference in London organized for the purpose of renegotiating and lowering tariffs. He got over there, was doing the best he could to get those agreements in place, ready to sign, and right at the point that Hull was ready to sign the agreements with other nations, Roosevelt makes a speech on the radio from Washington, D.C., saying that he would never agree to refrain from devaluing the U.S. dollar. Well, everybody knew at that time, better than they know now, that devaluation of the currency is just another way of winning the trade war. It's the flip side of tariffs. And so you can sell more goods to a country if you devalue your currency, the value of the currency you're paying for theirs, and gives you more buying power with regard to your own labor and so forth. And so when FDR made that speech from Washington, that London conference held in 1933 in July, actually blew apart. I mean, even the newspapers over here said that it was a torpedo of the conference. And so immediately everyone went away even madder at the United States for that trickery and deceit by FDR. Then the third thing on taxes, and the major tax increase of 1932, did he repeal it? He not only did not repeal it, he raised taxes and added new taxes every year of his entire 4 terms in office until his death, except one year, 1939, when the only reason taxes were not raised that year at his behest was because the Democrats in Congress had lost, I believe it was 83 seats in the House in the 1938 midterm elections. And the Congress was insisting that we cut taxes, but Roosevelt wouldn't agree to it. I've got another story about that as well. That is a very important part of the evidence, but I'll get back to that later. So those 3 things that he was elected to do, he did the opposite. And then let's look at what else he did. Yes, I just told you that he raised taxes every year that he was in office, that he could get it done. And that was every year extremely devastating to the people in the country, hurting business even more than it was. But in addition to the raising of taxes, in 1933, the first thing he did, even though he had, one of the first things he did was to say he was not going to devalue the dollar. But what he did order immediately is that all the gold in the country, except 1 ounce per family or person, or I think it's 1 ounce per household. You could keep 1 ounce, but all the other gold had to be turned into the Treasury, and you accept $20.67 for it. The excuse for that was that people are hoarding gold, and that can't be allowed. We have to get people spending their money and investing it so we can get prosperous again. Well, the only reason people were buying gold is because their factories had been put out of business. They had to liquidate for whatever they could get for it, pennies on the dollar in most cases. And whatever capital they had left, they couldn't invest it because there was no business. And so as a result, they had to buy gold to try to preserve their purchasing power. But Roosevelt orders that they turn in their gold, $20.67. Put federal crime penalties on failure to do so. And so the gold was turned in, and by the end of the year, that's pretty much done. And what does he do? January 31st of 1934, he then devalues the dollar. Now, let's look at this from the standpoint of the people who are out here in the country starving and so bereft of any money to spend or invest. The ones who had bought the gold, it's easy, I'm sure, for you to understand, Dunnigan, because they paid $20.67 for it. And if he had wanted to help the country by devaluation, he would have devalued the dollar immediately and then required the gold to come in.
Right.
He felt he had to do that. That would have meant something like a 69%, 67% increase in the amount of money they had from the time they bought it to the time it was devalued. That injection of money into the country would have been a tremendous help. But FDR specifically said he was designing the devaluation to make certain that not one additional dollar was added. And he blamed it on, I don't want those banks to have any more money than they've already got.
Huh.
Well, it was the people that they were smashing who were hurt by it. And what did he do with all that money? As soon as the gold got into the government and he then devalued the dollar, all of the profits on that went into a secret organization inside the Treasury that still exists today called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And it has been manipulating world politics and markets ever since. Completely unfettered by U.S. federal laws. By the law setting it up, it is not required to comply with any federal laws, any laws of the U.S. And it has been a major part of the deep state since that time. Okay, we've covered those three areas, plus the devaluation, which could not have been mistaken as anything other than a brick to the head of the people who were trying to make it economically and financially in this country. It was done in such a way as to enrich the international banks, the ones that are called Wall Street banks, but are owned internationally. Still to this day, the Federal Reserve is controlled by the Wall Street banks because the Federal Reserve the stock is owned by the banks that have the largest capital. You own capital in the stock in the Federal Reserve based on the amount of capital you have, and the Rothschilds are still said to own, I believe, 56%, something of that nature, of the total stock in the Federal Reserve. So those parties would know what was on the agenda for FDR. They would know to buy gold in dollars for $20.67 and be ready to cash it in overseas at their international banks and make that 70%, and they could do that overnight because they knew the schedule of it. That's the kind of financial fraud that existed then, and in my estimation, we have it in spades, and we've had it ever since in spades, all the way through the history of the 20th century and into the present day.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in there with a few interjections. One is that when we first were discussing bringing you on the channel, and the title and the premise of your book about the bankers in collusion with the government, painting the 20th century and even beyond now as really a bloodbath for the middle class and for the common man, it smacks of what people always are told to discount as conspiracy theory, as something that sounds sensationalizing, something that doesn't sound reliable. But I was struck in reading through your book with the scholarly content and the amount of documentation and footnotes and explanations and the inexorable conclusions that arise from just the detailed facts that you expose in this book. If people are really serious about understanding what's really been going on for the last century and are open to understanding that this has been smeared, all of these things that you were talking about, the Exchange Stabilization Fund, some people even question the existence of that or scoff about this secret dark pools of money and all that sort of thing, but seriously, that was one thing I really wanted to point out about the scholarly nature of your work, and really encourage people to take a look at the Fruits of Graft, the book itself. Another thing you mentioned was the echoes from the past to the present, and I really would like you to start making some of those connections. But before we leave the past, I just got to ask you a question that always comes up when we talk about the formation of the Federal Reserve, and that is, why would any country in their right mind, any free country, accept and take on the servitude of having to purchase or borrow their currency into existence at interest from a private bank? How could that have ever been foisted on the American people?
It's done by political subterfuge and various aspects of bribing people and so forth. There were actually a number of very capable statesmen who warned in great detail about the central bank and the dangers it held. You recall, of course, that Andrew Jackson was elected on the basis of his opposition. That was in 1828. His opposition to the central bank at that time.
Right, and he actually carried that out, right?
Yes, he certainly did. He was able to win a re-election on the basis of that issue in a landslide again, and so terminated that bank despite ferocious activity by them to murder him. He had multiple assassination attempts on him, and he defended himself with his own guns that he carried. That was his protection, and it was a remarkable circumstance. And we have, since then, my book also covers additional assassinations of Garfield, for example, in 1881, 100 years before Reagan. Also shot within 3 months after his inauguration, because he was nominated by a runaway convention of the Republicans, ordinarily controlled by the ruling elite. But the people demanded, he wasn't even asking for the nomination. And by the time he got to the inauguration, he had been threatened by the senior senator from New York, obviously the operative again of the ruling elite banks, that probably more than history tells us the threats, but at least we know that he was threatened he would never be successful as president if he didn't agree to allow that senior senator to appoint the Secretary of the Treasury and also the tax collector at the Court of New York, which was the main source of federal revenues at that time. He refused to accede to that, and in fact, because of those threats, he rewrote his inauguration speech and stated that he intended to refinance the federal government. That is to redo the kind of debt instruments that undoubtedly the big bankers had. And in that circumstance, he was shot by a so-called lone assassin. I don't want to get too deeply in that because we could point again to the assassination of McKinley at the just in 1901 to put Teddy Roosevelt in office. Again, the kind of circumstance in which that McKinley was running against an imperial state, creating additional wars like the one that had happened in his first term in office, the war against Spain. And then we have Kennedy and the attempted assassination of Reagan. All of these have been of the same nature of disposing of any elected, especially president, who is unwilling to serve those ruling elite. And we can connect later about how, in spades, that is the circumstance of our current administration. That is, they're being attacked by the ruling elite because a man, I believe, was recruited to run for president who could afford to pay for it himself and actually had the funds to confront and beat the ruling elite, who otherwise completely controls candidates who must depend upon them for the big money to run presidential campaigns. And I would be happy to go into that more later. But if I may, I just have to try to put a cap on the things that Roosevelt did. You have to take into account that right now the propaganda is that Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, is one of the great presidents, right up there with Washington and Lincoln, he is said to be, and maybe even ahead of one or two of those. Now, that is a preposterous lie when you look at the facts of what he did. Even after my book came out, a prominent academician wrote another book called Traitor to His Class, again trying to make FDR a hero. I wrote to that author, professor, never got a response. And this is the same kind of thing that controlled media keeps trying to lie to the American people about. And I do appreciate your saying nice things about my book. It is far more careful and articulate than I can be in just oral discussions about the evidence. But let me tell you a couple of more things that our parents had to live through and survive in order to survive at all the 1940s and the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. Because in addition to the things that I've already told you about that would put any country into a deep depression, he did this very important thing. Immediately in 1933, Roosevelt began having the Treasury buy gold on the open market. His alibi for why he was doing this is, if we can just get the price of gold up, then it'll raise the price of farm commodities and farmers will be better off. Well, it's preposterous, because the time he was doing this, we were already pegged to the gold price, $20.67. And when he changed that, we were pegged again at $35. So we never were really apart from a peg to the price of gold. But he was saying that gold buying was to get the price of commodities up for farm. It didn't work in any respect whatsoever. And after he repegged at $35, more gold buying would not possibly serve that purpose.
Right.
As you well understand. And yet he continued gold buying throughout his first term and every year of his second term right through 1940. In those 8 years, he bought more gold on the world market twice more gold than the United States had accumulated in its entire history up through 1930. He bought a total tonnage, 13,185.4, something like that, metric tons of gold, and he did it with tax money from people who were starving to death in the United States. Other people, other nations of the world were selling their gold because we had put them in the Depression. They were selling their gold in order to feed their people. We were buying the gold and starving our people. And I'll just interject at this point that the only two studies I've found about the number of deaths from starvation in the United States in the Great Depression, one study by a German says at least 3 million. One study by a Russian says at least 6 million. I can't vouch for the figures one way or the other. Those are the best numbers they have. But it was a very substantial number, millions of people dying. And that devaluation, for example, one of the reasons stated for why he wanted to devalue the dollar was so food produced by U.S. farmers could be sold more easily overseas. So they were exporting food while Americans were dying of starvation. When the gold buying by FDR became known to the public, one of the historical figures of the time was the chairman of the Bank of England, the chairman or director. His name was Montague Norman, a very staid, very conservative, low-keyed, soft-spoken type of person, very powerful, of course. But I read the quote of his reaction when he learned about Roosevelt's plan. And his comment quoted in the press was, "This is the worst news yet. The entire world will be bankrupted." Now, that is not holding your tongue. That is expressing great alarm, as you can well understand. I didn't understand why he would say that until it finally dawned on me when I studied it more and more, and also got additional evidence of the amount of gold bought. And the reason he said that is the key thing about buying the gold is that when it came into the United States, Roosevelt did not permit it to be monetized, as was required by the gold standard. When a country increased its gold holdings, it was obligated under the gold standard with other trading nations that nation with the additional gold was to monetize it so its people would have more funds, more money, and therefore they would be in a wealthier condition and thus able to buy more goods from the other countries that didn't have as much gold. Roosevelt was very careful to make sure that the gold he bought was not permitted to be monetized. I've got an additional thing to tell you about that. So you can see the flow of funds, tax money flowing out of the economy into the government's hand, into gold, and not allowing to be monetized. So that is why throughout the Depression, the condition in the economy that was expressed in every town and every city was nobody has any money.
Okay.
And that is what the people reported clearly at the time and was the clear result of his policies. Now, in addition to that, in 1935, the Federal Reserve Act, Reform Act, was passed, and essentially it added more governors to the Federal Reserve, and Roosevelt got to appoint them, and it essentially gave him control of the Fed. Now, what did he do when he got that control? Would he do something at the Fed that helped the people? in terms of providing more money? Exactly the opposite. The first thing that the Roosevelt-controlled Fed Board did was in August of 1936, and its first action was to increase bank reserve requirements by 50%. Now, there was no banking problem of instability at that time. I explained to you why we had one in 33.
Right.
And many banks had been put out of business then. But in 35, 36, they were stable. Yes, they had pulled in their horns, but they were not having runs. But to increase the reserve requirements by 50% means you have to call in 50% of your loans, even if they're performing. That meant you're going to have liquidation of all of those loans that were in a position to go ahead and make it. And yet, that's what they did. And of course, the papers showed lots of farmers, and the poor farmers misbelieving they could trust Roosevelt, pleading for his help to keep them from getting thrown off their land and out of their homes. No, that was Roosevelt's doing. And as soon as he was elected for his second term in 36, they liked the results of that liquidation so much that in January of 1937, they raised those reserve requirements again by another 33%. More liquidations, exactly the kind of thing that allowed the big farming entities to keep eating up this land, taking the land for nothing of the farmers and families that were driven off it. I could get into matters relating even to the Dust Bowl and the destruction of farms then, relating to the manipulation of farm prices to make sure that they were below production costs of the farmers 3 years in a row. And in that circumstance, they couldn't get another bank loan to replant the next year. The crops couldn't be planted or tilled, and so the soil goes into the air. It is just a remarkable effort to destroy the productive people of the United States to the maximum extent possible. I might say that Roosevelt even gave two speeches in his 1932 campaign that indicated he was fully on board with the elitists, the ones who took the view that the economy of the United States had gotten way too big, that it would never again be as big as it had been, that the number of jobs would never again reach the level they had been in 1928, and the economy was just going to need to be resized and downward. He gave that speech at the Union Club out in San Francisco, and he gave it again in New York City. But of course, that was not reported to the people who were going to suffer from it. Okay, one more item I need to put in. That is, in 1937, a large amount of gold was flowing into the United States because of the war drums beating in Europe. Factories and production capacity was being liquidated in Europe, and it was coming to the United States. Using currency to buy American dollars, that currency is then exchanged for gold under the international gold trading system. And so something like, I believe the number was $7 billion of gold was coming into the U.S. from that kind of gold flow in 1937, and somebody tipped off FDR about it. I have not been able to find out who tipped him. I don't believe it was Morgenthau, but somehow he learned about it. And he immediately notified both Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, and the the head of the Federal Reserve, who was by that time FDR's own appointee, and he notified both of them that he was very concerned about this hot gold that was coming in from Europe, that it might just be taken out of the country again, and we couldn't depend on that. And so we had to be sure that that hot gold was not monetized. So we want you to do something about that. So Morgenthau at Treasury dealt with the Federal Reserve at some length about it, and was unable to come to agreement. If the Federal Reserve the man's name was Eccles. He was actually from Utah, I think a very wealthy man, but nevertheless had the appearance, being from Utah, that supposedly more of a man of the people, perhaps. But nevertheless, he was arguing, and he even wrote a letter back to the Fed saying, no, I will not agree that we should not monetize this gold coming in from the trade window. It's here, and there's every reason we ought to monetize it, and it would be good for the country. But Morgenthau went back to Roosevelt saying, well, the Fed's just not agreeing. We can't come to agreement on sterilizing this. And so FDR calls a meeting of the three of them in the Oval Office in the White House. And when Eccles comes in from the Fed, along with Morgenthau, Eccles rolls over under the pressure of the president and says, okay, looks like maybe you're right, Mr. President, we won't monetize this. So we'll go back and write up regulations to keep this new $7 billion worth of gold. Now, that was a tremendous amount relating to the size of the entire economy. You're talking about an economy that was something like $17 billion, as I recall. And so $7 billion worth of new gold monetized would have been a real shot in the arm. But they go back and write the regulations and put them into effect. And in his diary, Morgenthau writes that when he was about to sign these regulations, it made him very uncomfortable to realize that he was signing regulations that kept not only the European gold from being monetized, but the regulations also said that even gold bought by the United States Treasury from domestic U.S. mines would not be allowed to be monetized. Do you tell me what the justification for that is? It was to continue the Great Depression without relief on the nickel on the dollar, 2 cents on the dollar, 3 cents on the dollar kind of prices that were in effect at that time. That is what Roosevelt did. There's one more little item, if you want to go into it. I think I've said so much about FDR. It's absolutely an outrage. But in 1939, when he wouldn't raise taxes, Morgenthau actually went over. Actually, he finally had lunch with him March 5th and said, Mr. President, if I've got some tax cuts that I'm wanting to propose to you, across-the-board tax cuts. If we adopt this kind of a plan, I believe we can promise you a boom within a month. And yet, Roosevelt was reluctant to do it, but Morgenthau prevailed on him. This was at a luncheon that they were having together. And he said, I want to bring my top man over to the White House and show you our plan. And I think you'll love it. And I'm going to bring you a little sign that I have in my office. I have one just like the one I have that says, does it help the recovery? People love it when they come into my office and see that. And so 2 days later, he takes John Haynes, Morgenthau and Haynes go over. He's the undersecretary in charge of tax policy. And they present the plan to it. And Roosevelt listens, but he immediately begins to criticize them and say, if you talk me into this kind of thing, people will think my enemies have won. They've beaten me down. I'll be dragged out of office by men on horseback. In other words, some kind of a coup or something of the sort. And Morgenthau's telling him, he says in his diary, "No, Mr. President, the people would love you if you had stopped this depression. You'd be the greatest president ever." And Roosevelt says, that little sign of yours is very stupid. This is not about recovery. This is a matter of politics. That's in the diary as edited, with the help of Morgenthau himself editing it as to what went on. And as he and Heinous left the Oval Office, the president raised his voice to them to say, "For God's sake, don't be so innocent." So I think we ought to be able to, as reasonable people, come to a conclusion that, yes, there was a culpable intent to make the Depression as hard an imposed famine on the American people as possible. My book waits until the 17th chapter to break it to the reader that there was a preconceived plan detailed at length to smash the middle class, to destroy as much of the human population as possible, not just in the United States, but worldwide. And that this was known in 1901, and the author of that book, and I call it the Elitist Manifesto to identify it, but that's not the name of the book. The author of that book was H.G. Wells, and he was invited as the honored guest to the White House of Teddy Roosevelt in 1901 or early 1902 to meet with him. And he came out after that meeting praising Teddy Roosevelt as the human demigod of whom I have dreamed. That is the kind of reception that was given to an Englishman, H.G. Wells, who wrote about the need to destroy the middle class in its entirety, and that it would take the destruction of the entire economy and society in order to do that, but it would have to be done if they were going to get back to the two-class society of rulers and slaves that was the proper, stable arrangement for society. That man was made famous by that book worldwide, H.G. Wells, and was invited back to the Franklin Roosevelt White House for extended stays on at least 3 occasions during Roosevelt's time during the Great Depression. In those circumstances, I think I'm convinced that reasonable people would conclude that their government had fully participated in imposing a famine in the same nature as the Stalinist famines imposed on Russia during that time period. So there was more in common between Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin than just Uncle Sam and Uncle Joe, as they called him. So what can I address for you at this point now?
Well, our time is out for this recording, but you have certainly broken open a very disturbing and chilling chapter of our history that really has shaped a lot of the 20th century and a lot of our upbringing. And the parallels, it's impossible to miss between what you're describing being rampant there from the collusion of elite bankers, international bankers, the raiding traders on Wall Street, and the full cooperation of the U.S. government and the ordinary person, the ordinary worker, saver, middle class as being the intentional victims of this to the present day. And that's what we'd like to see if we could bring you back on the channel another time when we could really bring it back up to the more present day, where you start to, in your book, you continue to draw on how the crash, the dot-com bubble and bust, and also the 2008 bubble and bust, and now we're rebuilding again, how these things are in fact orchestrated to line the pockets of the elite and to consolidate power and to disenfranchise true liberty and the middle class in our country. We'd like to have you back and see if we could address some of those with you, because you've been whetting our appetite all along the way with talking about some of the characteristics of either Teddy Roosevelt or FDR, the promises that they made, and so on, and Coolidge, Hoover, versus, you think we flash forward to not only JFK, but beyond that to Reagan and then to Trump, as far as being brash, outspoken, charismatic, and willing apparently to take on the powers that be, but really would love to get you back and ask some of your deeper reflections on whether what we're seeing is in fact Trump as an outsider or just another middle manager of this huge system. So
I'd love to do that. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate that. And I think there are two reasons for studying the Great Depression, or to learn about it, to learn the truth about it. One is to do the justice they deserve to the people who lived through it.
That's
because
right.
They've been blamed, including by the big lie of Roosevelt's first inauguration, that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. You weak little people out there, if you just get a little more courageous, it'll all be okay. That is a great lie, but that is where it begins. I think that we have a great deal to learn about that, and it gives us the vantage point about how to evaluate how trustworthy our government is presently, and how trustworthy it has been over these years by our various presidents. I am more encouraged right now than I have been in many years. In fact, I really earlier today, in response to an inquiry by another person who is in the financial sector, that yes, I'm speaking optimistically these days, because I still feel the exhilaration of having dodged the bullet on November 8th of 2016, because that was a very momentous thing. I don't even want to go again to discussing where we might have been if that election had been stolen, as was attempted. So in any event, I'll look forward to the prospect of speaking with you at your convenience. So let me know when would be a good time, and I'll be happy to be back. And maybe next time I'll think to turn on the light before.
Yeah, no worries. We have been speaking with Wayne Jett. He is the author of The Fruits of Graft, an exposition of how the major bank owners, international bank owners, in collusion with government, basically designed, orchestrated, caused, extended the Great Depression in the United States to intentionally destroy the middle class and consolidate power and wealth at the expense of the American people, and how that relates to ongoing mega principles that are still active in our finances today that we're all very concerned about and should be. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us this first time on Reluctant Preppers, and we'll be looking forward to having you back soon.
Thank you so much.
They say the stock market crashed today.
Yeah, I heard that.
Sounds like people's retirement accounts and savings accounts are going to get bailed into the banks.
Yeah.
Looks like pension plans and Social Security are going to get suspended too.
I know.
Sure, I'm glad we decided to put our money into gold and silver instead.
Me too.
Get your first ounce of silver at spot price and free shipping on any order over $99 at sdbullion.com/rp.